Thanks so much, Andrew. Yeah, when I was prepping for this talk today, I realized that I have an unusual position in the industry in that I am not a market researcher. I'm an engineer and I'm a CEO, and I serve market researchers. So when it came to understanding what I would actually talk about today, I wanted to talk about all of the issues that we tend to have as researchers, and I felt like the best way of actually doing that was to talk with researchers and understand all of the struggles that they have. So we surveyed a group of our market research users, and we talked to them about their surveys and the struggles that they actually have. And we really broke it down to 5 major points here. And interestingly, there is a common theme amongst all of these, and I think it will go very nicely with some of the other conversations that you've heard today. So one of the funny things about my position is that I see thousands of surveys, but our clients who are using the software in order to build surveys usually are not asking us to critique their surveys or provide advice, but we still see a lot of the common mistakes going out in surveys that sort of cause overall survey fatigue and in some cases actually erode the trust in the process with our stakeholders. The people that we're actually doing the surveys for and the businesses that will make decisions off of them. So today's topics are really going to be around that concept. How can we take these horror stories from the field, which we've amalgamized and boiled down to these 5 major key points, and then what we can do about them in order to improve our processes, and as market researchers or for market researchers, really, what can we do to improve? So pitfall number 1. And this probably does not surprise anyone. Bloated, overly long mega surveys. This was one of the more common things that came up when we asked researchers what problems they see in the industry, particularly those that are running smaller outside agencies, commented that this is a problem that they're constantly dealing with. What we thought was sort of surprising is we see these studies all the time. Our support team sees about 1,700 surveys a week, and we've seen surveys over 600 pages in the past, and you'd think that 600 is pretty bad, and it's worse, every page was a table. Well, they don't always start this way, and when speaking to market researchers, not just casual researchers, it seems a lot of the impetus for creating mega surveys really starts at the stakeholder level, and good project management can actually help to combat this issue. So everyone knows that as you're designing a survey with a group of stakeholders, if it's an internal group or it's a client, very quickly surveys can start getting out of hand. You can end up with dozens of irrelevant questions, competing objectives for the survey, because it's almost like you're offering them insight into their audience, and all of that pressure and all of those questions that they want to ask comes out. So speaking to the market researchers about this issue, the number one thing that seems to work is actually creating a step-by-step process and setting expectations up front. You can even tell your clients that this is likely to happen to us, and you've probably been asked to take one of these surveys. So we're going to design the survey to be highly focused on a specific objective and answer those questions without going too far afield. So good project management is key here. Set expectations that the survey that we want to produce is going to have as few questions as possible to answer our objectives, and actually have them write the objectives down. That was another suggestion. Write the objectives down before you go into sort of that question brainstorm session where your clients just sort of vomit questions at you. And then work with the client to actually go one by one and tie each of those questions back to the objective. And that's a really nice way of actually getting the client to understand that there's nothing wrong with these questions. And maybe they do need to be asked, but they can always be asked in a separate study later. And let's focus on what's actually important for the study right now. From a survey provider standpoint, I can say that if we could actually do smaller, more concise surveys, we're going to have an easier time getting people to take surveys and combating that fatigue. Because I think, as it was pointed out earlier, people are not robots, and they can't simply answer dozens of surveys with hundreds of questions over and over again and still give us good, intelligent data that we can trust. So in a related, although slightly different topic, questions that are too wide-ranging and general in scope. And we see this happen pretty often when clients don't necessarily understand that surveys are not always the best way of actually answering a question. And before you can do a quantitative study, you really do need to understand an unbiased view of what's going on in the market. We see very often that when objectives are not set early and there's no specific action plan for the survey in general, questions can go all over the place, as it's basically the client reaching out trying to do an exploratory study to understand some effect that's going on. And these should not be mistaken for quantitative data. It can lead to distrust. Again, this does come down to great project management and asking our clients, as one person put it, exactly what are we going to do with this, and are you prepared to act on the data that we're going to collect? And this will, again, help to focus the questions towards the objective of the study. Most customers or most respondents are willing to take studies, but there is a bit of a conversation going on between the survey and that participant. And if you start confusing them by ranging around topics, you'll start getting biased data. Again, the respondent's going to want to be helpful, and even if you're trying to be as unbiased as possible in your questions, they're going to start framing a conversation throughout the study, and they'll begin subtly trying to answer the question they think you're asking if there's any confusion. So stay focused and stay on topic, like a great conversation that you would have with a friend that's focused on one topic, rather than sort of taking this meandering road around. And that's one of the best ways to actually combat this problem, according to the people that we researched in this study. Pitfall number 3 was surprising. It turns out that finding representative sample is a big issue. And it's not the panel company that is necessarily the problem here. When drilled down and reading through the commentary, very often it's a communication issue. So in one set of cases, your client may not actually understand the population that they are surveying. And it might take a lot of extra work to really understand who they need to ask questions to, and to work with them almost with a pre-study, even if on occasion they don't want to do this, to make sure that they are actually getting representative data. The other problem that we sometimes see is that the project manager on the panel side is brought in very late in the process of the study, and the study is now done, the project is moving along, we're in a rush to actually get it out there and start fielding the study and collecting data, and we don't take enough time to actually communicate the point of the study to the panel project manager, and there's an assumption being made. And in that gap of that assumption, poor quality data can be collected that you might not notice until you actually get to the analysis side of it, in which case the project is slightly delayed, you have to go back, or you have to re-communicate expectations with the client about the data that you've collected. And this can lead to some embarrassing scenarios. The best option here is ask a lot of questions of your client about who are we actually studying. Try our best as market researchers to identify the unasked questions or the assumptions the clients are making that may not actually be the case. I can tell you as a CEO of a 10-year-old company, we don't always know as clients who our customers are. And we do need market researchers to provide that insight and to ask really difficult questions, even if as business owners and stakeholders, we find those questions terribly frustrating and annoying and somewhat threatening. But if we're going to make complicated decisions or decisions with a great financial impact, we need it. And I think that's what the market research industry really has to offer in a lot of cases. And then finally, take the time to communicate really effectively with your project manager on the panel side. They can really add a lot to this, and they can suggest some great validating questions throughout the study, not just with your initial screeners, in order to help you do good data cleaning and make sure that you've collected the right data. Again, trying to get around the problem of our respondents might misunderstand one or two questions, but if you're getting at that one objective from multiple angles, you should be able to clean your data and get a clear picture. Our next issue had a lot of emotion behind it. I remember actually before starting Survey Gizmo, I programmed surveys. I wrote them by hand in Cold Fusion, in ASP, in a number of programming languages, and this was definitely one of my pet peeves. Was you go through the entire build process, you're ready to go, and then all of a sudden you get last-minute changes that break all of your logic, destroys your validation, you're in a rush to actually get everything done. Again, I think the pattern here comes down to project management of stakeholders and setting good expectations. One of our participants actually had commented that larger consulting firms don't actually have to deal with this problem as much. But actually working with larger consulting firms, I can tell you that they actually have to deal with this problem just as much as small firms and inside insights groups do as well. No one's alone and no one gets to escape this, I think. Good project management can actually help, again, being candid with the stakeholders, saying, if there's one thing that we can avoid to be able to get this project done on time so you can make a decision off of the data and understand the insights that we're providing, is let's try to get all changes done by X date. And even saying that, even putting it into a project plan, there's still going to be last-minute changes. It happens. Build in time for it, and do your best to communicate very, very early. And don't forget to get those written objectives from early in the project. So reviewing your objectives and trying to push back a little bit on late changes that might add that sense of rogueness to the survey or increase the overall length of the survey. If you can remind them that the early objectives that you'd actually set out was to keep the survey short and very focused, that will also help you in this regard. Unfortunately, I don't think this is actually anything that we can do much about. It's just going to happen. From a tactical standpoint, I can tell you, we recommend everyone builds logic in as the very, very final step prior to launch, as most of the changes will tend to be around order of the survey, additional questions, last-minute gnarly little changes to individual options and qualifying questions, as well as, of course, the less disruptive changes to the overall styling of surveys. But if you can build in your logic and validation last, hopefully you can avoid some of the problems that I had actually programming surveys more than 10 years ago, and all of the horrible cleanup that you have to do when you launch your survey and realize that you forgot to test one logic branch and you destroyed a client study. That happened more than once back when I was doing this by hand, and I have to be honest, it still haunts me to this day. Our last of the 5 key points that came up kind of speaks to a problem that I hear very often market researchers talking about, which is we do all of this work, we produce clear results, and those stakeholders that actually asked us for this data and to run these studies don't respond to it, don't believe it, have already made a decision and moved on by the time we've actually provided the data they asked for, or they seem to actually be unwilling to listen to the results of the data. And I think there's nothing more frustrating than you putting your heart and soul into a project to serve a business need in particular, and then your business stakeholder looks at the data and doesn't do anything with it, or they use your results as a coffee coaster as opposed to actually an action plan or valuable data to make decisions. I can attest to this. I actually have been part of the problem here because I very frequently have asked my researchers for data, and by the time I got it, to be honest, I'd already made the decision. So looking at the feedback associated with this problem, oh, and also, if any of those researchers are on the line, I'm sorry. I probably should have listened and waited. My bad. But in terms of actually trying to solve this problem, creating clear expectations up front about when do you actually need this data to make the decision, and are you willing to defer making a decision to the point of actually getting that data. And if your stakeholder basically says we can't do that or no, then maybe doing something other than a survey is a better way of providing directional data as opposed to a true and full quantitative study. Doing as much work up front to get the client to understand and communicate what actions are you willing to take off of this data. And this is a tricky one because you don't want to bias the results or even how the stakeholder will look at the results of this data. But if they're not willing to act on the data, honestly, there's no need to actually do the study. And there are other ways to make decisions and mitigate risk than surveys. It's a little weird for me to say that, but it's true. And then finally, the last suggestion that came up is, even though the results are clear to the market researcher, make sure that they are presented clearly and in a way where the stakeholder can follow how you accomplish that data. Avoid black boxes. If the stakeholder cannot understand where the data came from or where your conclusions came from, they're going to have a really hard time trusting that data, and they may not be able to act on it. They're going to instead revert to something they do trust, their instincts. And that is where, unfortunately, way too many of the results of really good research get lost. I mean, you can do the best research possible, but if your stakeholder, if it doesn't resonate with the stakeholder, sadly, it's a waste of a great opportunity. So out of all of these items, in recap, what really came down as the overall theme was respondents, yes, they can sometimes pose some interesting data issues for the researcher. But overall, it seems to be that of the market researchers that we interviewed, one of their greatest pet peeves was actually the process of producing research in current business environments, particularly agile environments, where decisions are being made at such a rapid pace that traditional approaches to research sometimes seem to be getting in the way, and having to set expectations up front, having to focus on the objectives of research so that you can find the right questions and hopefully options that produce an unbiased result. All of these things are incredibly important, and communicating with stakeholders that are moving at the speed of light is an ongoing struggle that market researchers are going to have to embrace a bit of a role as a project manager at this point, and really keep those cats herded together really neatly until the point that you can actually hand off the data and then let them scatter, hopefully in the generally right direction. That is all I have for you guys this afternoon. I would be happy to answer any questions having to do with this.